Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and today we have the Shadowlands Dungeons ranked in a tier list style content. Okay, meme intros aside, I'm going to be going over the dungeons in the next few days, but to start all of this off, I did want to show a tier list of where approximately I'm going to be ranking these dungeons relative to one another. I do have some specific criteria that I believe makes dungeons better or worse than others, and we can start going over that criteria right now. So some of the criteria that I have come up with that is fairly important to me, first and foremost, is replayability. The ability to be able to do the dungeon over and over again and not feel like it's the exact same every single time or like there's nothing unique going on is fairly important. We're going to be doing these dungeons for a very long time across the whole entire expansion, and if they just feel the exact same between run in and run out, then there's no strategy to be able to be developed. There's nothing fun. There's nothing unique. This ultimately comes down to linear versus open dungeons as well, which tackles into my next point. The layout of the dungeons is very important to me. There are certain things that makes layouts in dungeons good or bad. Largely, whether or not it's linear versus open concept, where the checkpoints are located in dungeons as well is another very important thing to me, whether or not a dungeon has checkpoints or not as well. I just think that the layout for a lot of these dungeons should be most importantly about the strategy of how you pull the mobs and the dungeons themselves, and how you are attacking the timer based on the dungeons and based on the mobs that you are actively pulling inside of the dungeons. So the layout is of utmost importance to this. There can be situations where a linear dungeon has an okay layout, like we're going to talk about here in a little bit. But I don't want to have to go over 100% trash count if I take a very linear path through the dungeon. I think that is very important for linear dungeons to be a little bit more active decision making in terms of what you're pulling as well. But at the same time, if you do want to take the most direct path through the dungeon, you are also able to do that. So for linear dungeons, they should have some element of not going over 100% trash count. And then the last criteria is fun versus engaging. This is in relation to trash and bosses. There is an element of too engaging for some trash mobs. A fuck ton of casters is not fun, but it is engaging, right? You have to always be coordinating your kicks or getting stuff just CC'd properly or dealing with mechanics in a great way. And then there is an element of engaging where you need something that aren't just patchwork style mobs or patchwork style bosses, where there should be some mechanics that you have to be able to perform and an action that you have to be able to do to make sure that the run goes smoothly. So there has to be some level of fun versus engaging and a nice balance that is met between the two. All right, so let's start off in the D tier. And the first dungeon that will be in the D tier today will be The Other Side. I have placed The Other Side in the D tier because I feel like the layout is just god-awful for this dungeon as a whole. And the bosses in here are incredibly unfun. I cannot even express them. I cannot even express it more how unfun some of the bosses are in this dungeon. So I guess let's just start out with the first and most egregious issue that I have in The Other Side, the layout. It has the most convoluted checkpoint system I've ever seen. Basically, you'll walk into one of the side areas, you'll get a checkpoint, and it will start you at the beginning of the area that you've walked into. This is reasonable, right? Then you'll kill the boss, and then you'll update your checkpoint to the end of that area. Meaning that once you leave the area too, it doesn't re-checkpoint you at the beginning. It puts you very fucking far away. So then you'll start to clear trash and make your way towards the next area, and if you die, then your checkpoint system is fucking forever away. So they have a terribly convoluted checkpoint system. In addition to that, the count in this dungeon, you just naturally go over count by 30%, meaning that you're going to have to skip a lot in this dungeon just as a whole. And I think that for that reason, The Other Side is absolutely in the D tier. Tacking on to it, not even. So in addition to all of this, Hakar and the Mana Storms are just horrible. Hakar is going to be incredibly overtuned on Tyrannical just based on how the additional ads spawning end up working out and how his shield ends up scaling. So I suspect Hakar is going to be a major offender of this Tyrannical versus Fortified imbalance. Same with the Mana Storms. The Mana Storms, after a certain period of time, they will phase back and forth between Maleficent and whatever the dude's name is. So starting whenever you're fighting the dude, you're going to be like soaking these totems, and then after a certain period of time, you cannot kill him before you engage Maleficent. So you have to actually slow down your DPS as well. And then once she is engaged, you have to use Homeboy to be able to Shadow Fury Maleficent to be able to stop her from doing her chicken barrage on you. Both of those fights are just incredibly unfun, and yeah, I don't know how to explain it beyond that. The final boss, Muezala, is okay, but I feel like his abilities don't telegraph that well. Like the stomps, like with his hands that he ends up like clobbering down on the ground. I do think there's something interesting to do with the gates where you have to end up jumping from platform to platform to be able to kill ads that will eventually give you a damage taken increase on the boss, but those ads actually end up kind of killing the boss for you, so it makes the damage to the boss almost a moot point because you're literally just sitting there trying to survive the whole entire time. The dealer, which is the dragon boss, kind of dope though. The dragon style area, that's kind of dope. I do like that area, and I like that part of the dungeon. Next dungeon in the D tier today will be the ever so strong Plaguefall. So Plaguefall's layout is just god-awful with the least fun trash out of any dungeon I have ever seen. It is excessively long, with only one checkpoint creating major runback issues due to the sheer length. In the natural path of this dungeon actually makes you go about 25% count over, which is just a major red flag to me. I think whenever you're going over count by substantial amounts like 20, 30, 45%, you're like, what the hell am I supposed to do in this dungeon without a rogue or without some like weird ass tech that you're going to have to death skip or I don't know, conjure up some failure detection pylons again or something like that. So that in of itself is just terrible for me. The excessively long nature of the dungeon with very limited checkpoints is egregious as well. Let's start on the trash, which is, I think, the pinnacle of why this dungeon is as bad as it is. The Tentacle City in this dungeon after Dr. Ickis, which is the second boss, is so difficult to be able to deal with in a reasonable manner. Basically, you end up having to spend about 30 seconds of combat time to kill one singular tentacle, then it rains down these slimes onto your party, which you have to soak before you're able to drop combat, and then you'll be able to move from platform to platform there on after. You're going to end up having to kill 4 of these tentacles for 1.66% of your enemy forces apiece before being able to move on. And these tentacles and slimes are not really able to be pulled with other bosses or other I meant with other trash mobs, and it's like, it's so artificially slow. I think it's by far the worst part of a dungeon I've ever seen. So if you take Sporecaller Xantia from Underrot, the third boss, and instead of going right to where all the skeletons are, you go left and you go up in a worm alley trying to get to those double corruptors that are over there at the very end right before Unbound Abomination. If you go up Worm Alley, that's what it's like actually playing that area of Plaguefall. And they keep adding more and more fucking tentacles and more shit to this. And the trash in this dungeon is just so bad. I'm going to go over it more in a video tomorrow talking about why Plaguefall is the plague of BFA dungeons. I mean, this video series is going to be going through all of the dungeons and just talking about the pros, the cons, and whatever else associated with them. But the trash for Plaguefall is 100% the reason that it is in the D tier. So, up next, we have the C tier. And starting it off in the C tier, we have the Necrotic Wake. So Necrotic Wake's drawbacks, and the reason that's actually in the C tier, is that I feel like going 45% over trash count just makes this dungeon unbearable. It basically takes any redeeming quality out of this dungeon and just throws it straight out the window because nothing else matters whenever you're actually going 45% over trash count. I do like the flavor and the mechanics of this dungeon. The javelins, the hammers, the anima orb, all of that stuff that is on the ground. You're able to access it whenever you want and just pick it up on your own time and do whatever you want with it. I feel like these are great. And you can choose when you're using the javelins, the hammers, the anima orbs, and just really have some interesting strategy. And it increases replayability in Necrotic Wake because of this. And it makes for great, unique decisions. The Necropolis, which is the part after the second boss, is bad and buggy, where like most ground effect abilities just don't work that well in there. Lack of a checkpoint is also on my hit list of shit that I hate in Necrotic Wake. is very tubular feeling, and the absence of a checkpoint really just punishes you if you die at all. This, in tandem with the fact that you go over count so high, is going to make Rogue mandatory and feel absolutely as mandatory as Rogue was in King's Rest or Temple of Sethralus, for that matter, from Battle for Azeroth Dungeons. The next, in most, another issue with the layout of this dungeon, like almost all of these points are being docked from Necrotic Wake because of the layout. The next problem is that you get 65% of your count from gauntlet-style packs that spawn on completion of a previous pack, meaning that you don't have any opportunity to be able to like chain pull packs or double up if you would really like, or just do anything innovative with like CCing or anything. Actually, you're able to only pull as quickly as the mobs come a lot of times, and you have to kill them in full before the next pack ends up coming out. I don't know about you guys, but all my homies hate gauntlet styles like this, where your stuff is completely limited on and contingent on you actually just having the most DPS and finishing this part in as short a period of time as possible. The other C tier dungeon that we have is Spires of Ascension. Spires of Ascension is a very caster-heavy dungeon, similar to the front half of how Shrine of the Storm ends up working, forcing you to have fairly coordinated kicks in order to be successful in this dungeon. This is basically your Pug Nightmare dungeon. It's also incredibly long, and jumping from platform to platform feels cool as a gimmick. Like the first time you do it, it incurs a huge time loss, especially if you die and have to have a run back. I think that for me, it loses a decent amount of points on the fun versus engaging aspect of it, where it's like, I feel like it becomes too tedious, especially whenever you have to have such heavily coordinated kicks and just deal with everything like that. However, on the upside, the count in this dungeon is actually really well designed and set up in a way where you don't go over 100% trash count. You're able to kind of pull whatever you want. But just the jumping from platform to platform is very tedious, and one of the checkpoints in this dungeon is set up in a way where you have to, if you die, you have to take a 30-second like Valkyrie ride to be able to get back even on the same platform as your party, which I think that, okay, some of the platforms are like the Valkyrie rides are fine, but the ones that are 30 seconds long really make you wonder like why they're even there, because they just don't feel that great to have to take a 30-second ride whenever you're just sitting there watching your timer slowly tick down. You're like, what the hell? Okay, so moving on into the B tier. So first B tier dungeon we have today is Sanguine Depths. Sanguine Depths is actually the dungeon that I thought was initially on the first playthrough. I thought it was going to be one of the worst dungeons, but it's really not that bad. It's a linear dungeon and it's kind of cramped, but it's like 3 times the size of like Waycrest Manor or Toldagor in terms of like cramped, in terms of space that you have to be able to drop Sanguine or like actually move around. And it kind of does a linear dungeon decently. You go slightly over count if you just natively hold W and just like walk straight through the instance, but there's a lot of trash that you can just like naturally walk around and just not actively pull, and so you can still be fine with your trash count. You don't end up going over by a significant amount. There's also really good checkpoints in the dungeon. I don't think there's too many complaints with that. Favorite part of this dungeon is by far the final boss. It has like a trash gauntlet that you end up engaging while in combat with the final boss, so that's honestly the most interesting part for me. If you feel like you can tank the boss, the trash pack, and then if you wanted to pull more trash into that, you're able to actually do it. It's not a gauntlet in the sense of you're waiting for mobs to spawn and you're waiting for completion of the other pack to be able to do it. It's a gauntlet in the sense of like you have to run through and end up killing them all on the way. So they're all active at once and you're able to do that while you are actively engaged in combat with the boss. It's absolutely great. This, in conjunction with the fact that you can spawn Prideful while doing the gauntlet and the boss and get like multiple sets of damage buffs to be able to fight the boss and other trash mobs, is great. I actually find that absolutely spectacular. Downsides. Some of the trash I find is actually fairly tedious, notably the Grand Overseers. The Grand Overseer puts a 15-second debuff on you that reduces your damage dealt and healing done by 3% per stack, and he reapplies stacks every like 5 seconds, I want to say. So it kind of limits your flexibility into how many mobs you can chain like earlier on in the instance and how often you can double up on packs due to the density of the Overseers at the first half. I also found that there's a lot of like random neutral mobs in this dungeon. I don't love the density of the neutral mobs, especially since they're just like there'll be like a full room full of neutral mobs that I just don't understand why they're even there. So those are a couple things that I'm not super hot on in this dungeon. But as for linear dungeons go, this is a pretty good one. So now we have the best linear dungeon that we've seen. And the best linear dungeon that they probably could have created whenever you take the absolute concrete definition of what is a linear dungeon. Theater of Pain. Theater of Pain gives you 3 options of tubes that you can go down and fight small amounts of trash. It makes, small amounts of trash in terms of like pack size. These packs may be small, but they give you a substantial amount of count relative to the mobs that you end up fighting. And I feel like this dungeon is really well tuned in terms of trash percentage, and it has a absolutely superb layout. Whenever I say small trash packs, I think like King's Rest had like 3 mobs at a time that you would end up pulling. Theater of Pain, kind of similar in that vein. It also has a couple of very cool bosses. The PvP boss, where you end up having to, like, you get picked up and you have to go battle your friends, is super fun as a gimmick. I love bashing my friend and then just convoking them. I'll never end up doing this later on, but I do think that element of it is very cool. Same with the boss, where you end up collecting your soul and you gain a damage buff. I think any boss with a damage buff component to it, I just love that shit. I don't know what it is about it, but I love feeling a little bit more powerful. The downsides is I really worry about replayability in this dungeon. I feel like the dungeon's optimal path will be figured out pretty quickly due to where you want to get prideful, where you want to bloodlust, that kind of stuff. So with the small amount of trash pulls and the amount of trash that you have to kill, I worry that the dungeon won't be like very fun after doing it over and over again, because the replayability in of itself is not going to be that great. The mobs, the bosses, the dungeon itself is pretty good. Again, I just do worry about it getting a little bit stale after having played it over and over again. So now we start to move on into the better dungeons, and we have the A tier. Which dungeon will it be? Halls of Atonement or Mists? Well, it's actually Mists. So Mist of Tirna Scithe is I would describe it as a linear dungeon, but it's linear like Underrot. You actually have a lot of options where you're going, but it's not like fully open to be able to like pull based on interpretation, or like you're not able to like completely make your own decisions. It's linear like Underrot is how I've described it. There are basically multiple paths you can take, and you're able to get 100% of your trash count without a rogue skip, and it's really easy to not like just go substantially over if you don't have rogues or melds or whatever, right? The replayability of this dungeon is absolutely spectacular, and I think that's one of the high marks of this. I think that this dungeon, from dungeon to dungeon, the replayability will be amazing. The maze mechanic keeps stuff interesting, while at the same time only being 96 count per dungeon. So the mobs kind of change, which kind of freaks me out. Like, some of the packs are a little bit different, but the fact that you get the exact same amount of count is okay. Maybe I end up having a little bit bigger problem with that later on, but I do think it keeps it interesting. Bosses are awesome as well. The first and second boss implements elements of the trash seamlessly and make it flow together super well. Basically, the second boss has the maze mechanic implemented in the illusions, and the first boss has, like, you end up having to fight the tree, and then the tree, after you end up killing it, will put a damage taken increase on the main homie. I don't actually know names of bosses yet. I'll get there eventually, but not yet. So the first and second boss are great. The last boss, which is the Gahoon lookalike, has an interesting mechanic with how the dodges work and how he like will learn how you dodge and predicts like where you're gonna go. I think that's sick. The boss fight has been a little bit overtuned from time to time. I think also people are just kind of bad at it still, so it's hard to say where that fight will end up. I do like it though, as a point of concept. Points in this dungeon were deducted absolutely because of the checkpoints in this dungeon. I think that if you were able to open up the gate to the left once you start the instance and have checkpoints after the first and the second boss, I probably would have put this dungeon in the S tier category. But since those things are lacking, or rather are gated behind of Night Fae Covenant, then I think I'm forced to put this in the A tier. So, that leaves Halls of Atonement in the S tier. Halls of Atonement is by far the most open dungeon in this expansion, and the pathing and options that you are allowed to play in this dungeon really push this above and beyond a great dungeon for me. you are able to have your strategy and pre-planning set into motion beforehand, and it has a lot of fun and engaging trash that none of it feels too easy. Yeah, but at the same time, it doesn't feel too difficult. There aren't a ton of casters. There aren't a ton of anti-kite mechanics either, so now your tank is actually able to run around, group up all the mobs, and then kite around while your melee aren't just going to get randomly clocked by a bunch of stuff. But at the same time, you're not able to pull just like too big every single pull. So there's a good balance of fun and engaging here. And I think that this dungeon hits fun and engaging absolutely spot on. Layout, again, perfect layout in terms of the openness of the dungeon, just based on like how you're able to pull trash packs. I would relate it similar to how Freehold was set up, where there is like a natural path that you have to make through the dungeon, but all in all, you're able to kind of make your own path in terms of what mobs you actually want to pull or where you would like to skip mobs even. I think that's absolutely spectacular, and that's why Halls of Atonement's in the S tier. I do have a couple of problems with Halls of Atonement. It's not all perfect. I think that the downsides are that there is not a checkpoint in the dungeon. I think that there probably should be a checkpoint after the second boss and the third boss even. The dungeon isn't terribly long, so you don't get overly punished. So it's kind of okay, but like, again, I'm more of a over checkpoint kind of guy rather than under checkpoint kind of guy. I also do wish that Echelon, the second boss in this instance, doesn't have a mandatory decurse, because I hate how that stuff even limits your composition of what you're able to actually bring even further. So those two things kind of lose points for me, but none of them are as egregious because Halls of Atonement isn't super long, and because, like, I don't know, just bring a decurse class. I don't know. I'm not a lover of the decurse. I still hate that shit. But you're able to like bop it off and freedom it off as well. So there's other things that you're able to do to be able to deal with that mechanic on Echelon. I don't know. Not huge on it. But Halls of Atonement, only S tier dungeon, really gets carried super hard by layout in terms of like pathing availability and replayability. Of course, you're able to actually just come up with your own strategy, pull time in and time out. There's going to be new things that you're able to do, and it'll probably be the most innovative and most changed dungeon in terms of how people are playing it across the whole entire Shadowlands expansion. So if you guys enjoyed the video, make sure you guys check back here tomorrow. We will have probably a Plaguefall video talking about the problems inside that dungeon, going a little bit more in depth than this cursory view of the tier list. I hope you guys did enjoy this video today, and I will see you guys tomorrow.